All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 10th edition of the Managerial Insight series. Seems like just a couple weeks ago that Ray and I were talking about this idea, and I guess it's COVID time. It's kind of gone by quickly, and now it's already the middle of summer. Um, so this is the second to last edition. This series is a partnership between the Executive Education Department of the Darla Moore School of Business and Mike Switzer and the South Carolina Business Review. How's it going, Mike?
Yeah, going great. Thanks for including us. It's we've had a good time. 11 weeks now. Well, 10. One more week.
And my name is Mark Cicchini. If you're wondering why there's a decidedly less British accent talking to you now, I will be taking over for Ray in Exec Ed starting, I guess, Wednesday of this week. And so Ray is giving me one final test to make sure that I'm up for the task. And I do, so while I'm less British than Ray, I do like hot tea. So I have that going for me. But so today we're going to hear from Deborah Hazzard. Deborah is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Inclusion at the Darla Moore School of Business. Deborah's also a clinical assistant professor in the management department. Deborah's going to be speaking about leading with inclusion during a time of crisis. Before I hand it over to Deborah, just a couple housekeeping items. We're going to be recording this session, and a couple days from now, the session will be available at the Executive Education website. Presentation materials will be distributed right after the talk today. There's going to be a Q&A period at the end of the session, and you can ask questions anytime. So if you have a question now, you can submit it. You just have to submit it through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And that's all I've got to say. So I'm going to now exit, and I'm going to leave it to Deborah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Mark. What I will do at this juncture is share my screen here with everyone. Get my presentation pulled up, so I appreciate your patience while I do that. So here, the title of my presentation is Leading with Inclusion During a Time of Crisis. First and foremost, I am very thankful for this opportunity to share insights, share my perspective, and share knowledge with all of those on the call. And also certainly am appreciative for both Ray and Mike and Mark and everyone involved in this effort for the Managerial Insights series. I think it's very relevant and timely. So as Mark mentioned, I am the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Darla Moore School of Business. I am also a clinical assistant professor in management. The courses that I teach at this point largely focus on corporate social responsibility, management, and also diversity and inclusion. Those are all areas that I'm really, really passionate about. And so today, it is indeed a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you a little bit about leading with inclusion during a time of crisis. So why is it that we even need to have a conversation about inclusive leadership during a time of crisis? Well, there are a number of reasons. One of which is that when we find ourselves in the midst of crisis, fear tends to set in, a great deal of uncertainty tends to set in. And what we're finding is that people have a tendency to somewhat abandon things like diversity, equity, and inclusion during times like this. We're finding that it's necessary for us to just sort of remind people that it's extremely important now more than ever that we continue to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're seeing, particularly in the marketplace, our global business environment, we're seeing heightened incidences of what we call xenophobia or xenophobia. And it basically means fear of the other. So in the midst of all of this uncertainty, in the midst of all of fear, the fear that there is about what's going to happen, how it's going to affect us, how we're going to move forward, we have a tendency to sort of buy into this xenophobia and engage with others who are different from us in a way that's not necessarily productive. And so today we want to just kind of talk a little bit about the importance of not buying into that xenophobia and really rejecting the status quo, because what's becoming more and more prevalent is that we reject things and people that are different from us. And that's just not really a good strategy for us to buy into. So that being said, what we really want to do is kind of jump into today's presentation. Now, I will tell you that anyone who knows me knows that I absolutely love quotes, and I typically refer to them as sort of food for thought, because I think it's important for us sometimes to really examine ourselves through insights and things that have been shared by other people. And so the quote we have here really just challenges you to become more self-aware. I'll give just a second or two for you to kind of look at that, read through it. But it truly is about, recognizing that in order to reach others and be effective in reaching others, we have to become more self-aware. We have to really question who we are, what we believe in, and what we believe to be true about ourselves. And so I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind as we begin this discussion about diversity and inclusion in a time of crisis. So I have an agenda here. It seems pretty packed, but I promise you that it will not take us an extended amount of time. When I'm talking about diversity and inclusion related topics, I tend to start out with what I call agreements for engagement. And why do I do that? I do that because this is a topic that has a tendency to be quite sensitive. Sometimes people sort of take offense even to discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we like to start out with agreements for engagement, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. And then we're going to set the stage a little bit, talk a bit about the context for these discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you know, not only are we navigating through a pandemic currently, but we also have concerns related to quite a bit of racial unrest that is going on. So we really want to set the stage, establish the context for not only conversations, but also actions. We'll talk a little bit about what some of the challenges are for organizations and their stakeholders. I'll share some insights and guidance for leaders and managers, particularly as it relates to facing some of today's challenges and uncertainty through an inclusive lens. And then, as Mark mentioned, we'll end with a Q&A session. So when we talk about agreements for engagement, other people call these rules of engagement. I don't like to do that because I think that's sort of adversarial in nature. So I say agreements for engagement. And so what I ask respectfully is that when we approach not only this subject of diversity and inclusion, but even conversations around it, that we really think about the things that you see listed here. And I promise I won't read them all to you, but really think about withholding judgment. Think about allowing yourself to be open to new ideas, new perspectives, allowing yourself to not necessarily agree with what's going on, but to respectfully disagree if necessary. So it's okay to not agree, or to not understand or not know. But I think the most important thing, particularly with topics of this nature, is to just be respectful as we engage. But courageous and candid conversations are truly what it takes for us to be able to understand other people who are not necessarily like us, and for us to be able to engage effectively across difference. Typically, when I start out talking a little bit talking a bit about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I suggest for all of the people that are under the sound of my voice that they just take a second to reflect. And so I'll ask you all to do the same today. If you would, take a second to reflect on your own childhood, on how you were reared, what you were taught. Not only about people like you, but more importantly, about people who were not like you. Were there stereotypes that you learned about people who were different from you? What values did you learn through socialization? Okay. And then was there any particular experience, moment, or event that transformed how you think about people who are different from you? Again, I'm going to ask you to just sort of take a little bit of time and think through that. And as you're doing that, I'm going to kind of share with you why this is important. What I am asking you to do is to think through or think about your story. Why is your story important? Your story is important because your story establishes the lens or the framework through which you see things and other people. Okay, so that lens that you bring to the table is all about how you were socialized, what you were taught when you grew up, the people that you were around in your area, whether or not that was in an urban or suburban or rural, whatever your class, identification was. All of those things are extremely important. They impact you as an individual, but they also impact how you see others. It's the lens through which you see things. Now, stories are so extremely important, and I'll take a really quick opportunity to share a story that I think is particularly relevant, especially at this time. So in terms of my own story, a particular experience that transformed me, that was very impactful, I tend to think back to my childhood. I was going to the 6th grade at about this time. My brother was going to the 7th grade. So we were, I was a rising middle schooler, and I remember being in the neighborhood that we lived in. It was not a diverse neighborhood at all. It was a pretty large neighborhood, several hundred families. And from my recollection, from my count, there may have been about 3 or 4 African-American families in this neighborhood. So I remember one day, my brother, sister, and I hopped on our bikes, rode to our middle school because we just wanted to play. It was what we did on the weekends, and this was on the weekend. Hopped on the bikes, rode to the middle school in our neighborhood, and we were there just kind of riding around. At one point, we put the bikes down. We went inside in the gym. It's what kids did. There were also some adults who were in the gym playing basketball. So the reason that this was something that was so impactful and something that I will never forget is that while all of this was going on, and as kids we were just sitting playing, etc., some gentlemen who were there playing basketball claimed that their wallet was missing after we were in the gym playing. And so literally we had this gentleman tell my brother and I that we could not move. He basically told us that we needed to sit down and wait, and that he was going to call the cops. This should not even matter, but I will tell you that this gentleman was a white male, and of course we were African-American children. So we're in this neighborhood. He's saying that we've done something with his wallet. His wallet is missing. I know that we haven't done anything, but he literally tells us, you cannot go anywhere. You must stay here. I'm going to call the cops on you. We were mortified. Now, in all of this, my sister, who was much younger than us, was not around at the time that the guy forced us to stay in place. So my sister hops on the bike, runs home, grabs my parents, and tells them what's going on. By the time my parents arrive at the school, the police are there, and my brother and I are being questioned. It was absolutely one of the most traumatic things that I've ever experienced, because I knew in my heart we had done nothing. I knew my brother had done nothing. I just felt like it was a huge mistake. What I remember more so about that story than anything is that when the police arrived, they gave us the benefit of the doubt. They showed us grace. They did not automatically assume, because of our identity, because of where we were, they did not automatically assume that we were in the wrong. What we learned after our parents came And the police started questioning the gentleman who made the claim and who had essentially held my brother and I without allowing us to leave. What we learned is that the gentleman had never brought his wallet from his vehicle. He'd left it in his car before he came inside the gym to play basketball. He never admitted that to us. The cops, the police officers told us that after the gentleman left. There was no "I'm sorry," there was no "it's my mistake" or anything like that from the gentleman. But what I recall is that the police officers showed us grace. They withheld judgment. And so when we talk about stories and how stories are the foundation of our identity, they make us who we are. They sort of, help determine how we react in certain situations. Those are the kinds of stories that are extremely pivotal. When we talk about meaningful conversations, meaningful experiences, one of the things that we often talk about in the D&I space is storytelling. Again, stories are the foundation of our identity. They help make sense of who we are. They help others understand where we fit, who we are. It enables others to have empathy. And it allows us to interact and engage with people, have conversations. And some of those conversations give people more insight into who we are. Now, when you're listening to those stories, there are a couple things that we suggest that you do. Active listening, of course, is so very important. And so I appreciate you all for doing that as I am sharing today. But not interrupting, being very interested in what you're being told. Validate whatever feelings or emotions that people have. Really listen, and listen with a learner mindset, where you're trying to learn and understand what this person is sharing. And it's also extremely important to be able to echo. I heard you say this. I understand it made you feel this way. So those are things that are imperatives when we talk about active listening. When we talk about storytelling and sharing our stories, it really does make us more resilient. It helps us connect with other people, and it absolutely helps to relieve a level of stress. So that is one of the reasons that sharing stories is so very important. So you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with businesses and what they need to do during this COVID-19 timeframe, during this pandemic, or during this time of racial unrest? It is so very important to understand, to seek out and understand the stories of your stakeholders, be it your employees, be it your customers, suppliers, etc. What are their stories? What are their experiences? Why should we be mindful of those things? How does it impact how they engage with us? It's so very important. So telling stories and also listening to the stories that are shared by others. We've learned during this time frame with COVID-19 and the racial unrest that the way that we get to effectively engage and manage across difference is by interacting and engaging in a meaningful way with people who have different experiences than us, because that enables us to do what I call perspective taking, to sort of put ourselves in their shoes and sort of try and glean insights from what their experiences might, or what that may have felt like. So perspective taking is so very important. I've talked before about leading with empathy. Leading with empathy is so very important because empathy is a primary factor in inclusion. So we talk about creating these environments where people feel visible, they feel valued, they feel respected, they have a sense of belonging. What is a really significant factor, motivating factor in that inclusion is empathy. Showing compassion, having empathy for others. So one of the things that I tend to do is I establish the context for conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion is to really start with sort of dispelling some myths. So typically when we talk about diversity, there are many people who assume that we're talking about race. This is all about race, and some people absolutely disengage from the very beginning because they assume that diversity is only about race. Diversity isn't only about race. However, race is still a very important dimension or factor in the diversity discussion. Diversity is truly about difference, all the ways in which we differ. In the way I see it, it's also about ways in which we're similar, because I believe that there is a lot more that unites us than separates us. And so if we can sort of abandon this notion that people who are different are bad, then I think that we can really make some huge steps towards becoming a more inclusive environment and a more inclusive culture. What you see here is the diversity iceberg. And so what we learned by looking at this model is that only about 20% of those differences that we all have are things that are visible to the eye. And that's what is above the waterline of visibility, as you see here on this particular graphic. So what is above the waterline of visibility is only about 20% of the differences that we have. What you see below the waterline of visibility, and you see some of those things are languages, family status, sexual identity, beliefs, etc. That 80% is below the waterline of visibility, which means that there's difference there, but it's not necessarily visible to the human eye. So I think this is something that's really important, that again, it sort of goes back to where we talk about withholding judgment and not making assumptions when we begin to talk about diversity and what diversity really is. Now, this is another model, and this is the model that I tend to really love, because this one to me is a much broader representation of diversity. So you see at the very center is personality, and then we have internal dimensions such as race, ethnicity, physical ability, gender, etc. We have external dimensions, which include income, personal habits, appearance, work, experience, etc. Educational background is included there as well. And then you have organizational dimensions. So on this particular model, I think this is a much more robust model, and I really do enjoy using this model as I'm teaching about diversity and inclusion, because I think one of the most important things is to try and bring those people back in who initially disengage when they assume that diversity and inclusion is only about race. It's about so much more than that, but yes, absolutely, race is important. I will point out, because I think it's important, that while people assume that race or gender or things like that are the factor that most impacts or most influences how people engage in the workplace, it's actually personality. Personality is that factor that most influences how people engage in the workplace. But again, I think this is an excellent model that really helps people understand that when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ensuring that we understand the perspectives and the insights of the broad spectrum of people that are in our organizations, these are some of those dimensions that we're referencing. Now, as organizations, what we're really here to talk about today, in addition to all of this, is to really understand how the trends, how what's currently going on is impacting our organizations, and what sort of strategic moves we can make in light of those things. And so that being said, I think it's extremely important for us to acknowledge that there are a number of trends that are impacting organizations. And you see many of them listed here, not the least of which is changing demographics, multiculturalism, of course, our socio-political environment. I've talked a lot about the fact that there's a great deal of sort of us versus them going on right now, and that xenophobia. We really need to move beyond that. We need to sort of refuse to get involved in that and truly recognize that we're all in this together. That's my suggestion, that when we understand that we're all in this together, we'll begin to work hand in hand to come up with ideas, with strategies, with frameworks, such that we'll all be successful, much more innovative, much more creative. So here the trends are listed. Again, in addition to the changing demographics, there are a number of things that are impacting our organizations. Just sort of an overview as it relates to the demographics. I think it's important for all of us to understand that in terms of the demographics, the demographic is changing. We're becoming more brown and more multicultural. But I don't think that's something that should strike fear in people. I think we should see it as an opportunity to embrace those things that are different, but also look for commonalities. But, you know, as you can see here from the graphics, what we're finding is with the younger generations, they are becoming, less white, if you will, and also more multicultural. And so those are things that I think are extremely important. And I can't say enough that when we see the demographics, there is a shift in terms of what we're looking like, but I don't think that's something that should be approached from a negative perspective or talked about that way, because again, that sort of buys into that xenophobia or fear of the other. Here, one of the things that's extremely important, and I truly try and point this out as well, is that for the first time, we have an unprecedented 5 generations in the workforce. That in and of itself is huge from a diversity perspective. And for the first time, or I should say not necessarily for the first time, but I should say that it's extremely important to note that millennials became the largest generation in the labor force a couple of years back. And so we need to sort of look at that, understand that. And so when we talk about diversity as well, it's important to acknowledge that the different generations have different communication styles, different learning styles, different ways that they engage. And so what we really have to do is try and take the time to figure out how we can come together and be better as a whole in light of the changing demographics. So one of the things I think that's extremely important for us to sort of think about as we're having this discussion is what we call a changing social contract. Now, when I talk about changing social contracts, some people get a little bit confused as if this is an actual explicitly written contract somewhere, but it's not. It's an implicit contract. It's basically, when we talk about the social contract, it's society's expectation of how corporations will engage, how corporations will treat their stakeholders, how they will engage with the environment and the marketplace around them. And so what we're finding is that, especially with the millennials and the post-millennials, they're very, very committed to social justice, very committed to corporate social responsibility, and are really holding organizations accountable for what they do. And so we're seeing much more of that now, even with some of the strategic moves that companies are making, especially as of late, with many of the commitments, financial commitments, very significant financial commitments that are being made in light of some of the racial unrest, where companies are coming out and saying, I'm going to commit X amount of dollars towards these things, or X amount of dollars towards scholarships for historically Black colleges and universities. We're also seeing organizations such as Wells Fargo that has come out recently and said, hey, we're going to set the standard here by holding our executives accountable for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they're incorporating it into the structure of how they evaluate their managers. That is a huge thing, because diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be established. It has to be, that culture has to be established at the top. And when the CEO says every one of my leaders is going to be held accountable, for diversity in their ranks, that's huge. That's extremely important. Now, as we continue to sort of unpack this notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it impacts organizations, particularly during crisis, I will tell you that one of the things that affects organizations, and in particular their leaders, is what's called unconscious or implicit bias. So unconscious bias truly is what we talked about earlier. It's your lens, it's your frame of reference, it's how you see things. People have a tendency, I should say, to believe that unconscious bias, to admit that they have unconscious bias, means that they're saying that they're a bad person. Absolutely not correct. To have unconscious bias is to be human. We all have it. It doesn't mean we're a bad person. It means that we're human. But the thing that's extremely important for us to take into account is that we need to be aware of those biases, and we need to understand how that bias impacts our decision making. So very important. So the thing that I'd like to point out here, there is a very good book by Daniel Kahneman, and he has this model here about system 1 and system 2 thinking. And so what he says is that the majority of the decisions that we make are actually system 1 decisions. It involves intuition and instinct. So we do it very quickly. We make associations, categorizations. It's unconscious. It's almost like being on autopilot. 95% of the decisions that we make are system 1. Well, let me tell you that most system 1 decisions are inherently biased. Okay, and then when we move to system 2, that's more rational thinking, where we have slowed down our thought process. We're making more logical decisions. We're a little less decisive because we're sort of challenging some of the assumptions that we have, and we're making a concerted effort to disengage from some of that autopilot or some of that automatic association or categorization that we typically do. So I would say to you that the most important thing to do when we sort of begin to look at bias and how it impacts our decisions is to know that we should try our best to move more to system 2 decisions and system 2 thinking as opposed to system 1. And so that's something that we really like to share. It's been said that unconscious bias is the Achilles heel of leaders and managers. And I'll repeat that because that's something that's extremely important. Unconscious bias can be the Achilles heel of leaders and managers. So it's very important that we bring the unconscious to conscious. And then once we become conscious of it, put strategies in place to be able to disengage from bias. Now, as organizations, as businesses, you may ask yourself, well, how does this unconscious bias affect what I do in my organization? How does it affect my workplace and the decisions that we make? Well, there are a number of unconscious biases that have been found to impact the workplace. And I've listed a couple of them here, and I'll give you an example of about 1 or 2 of them. The very first one that you see here is affinity bias, okay? Affinity bias. And it basically says that we have a tendency to gravitate towards people who are like us. So how might that impact my organization? Well, here's the thought. When you are giving special stretch assignments, when you are pulling together team assignments, when you're coming up with succession, when you're in the succession planning process, this affinity bias tends to sort of come into play. And so essentially what we're saying is we tend to gravitate towards people that we think have similarities, that we feel comfortable working with, and those people tend to benefit more in organizations than those that we don't necessarily feel an affinity to. That's one way that it can impact our decision making. Another thing that we have here, and I have listed here, confirmation bias. And I think this is particularly important in this particular environment that we're currently in. So when we talk about confirmation bias, it's really that, you know, we can be interacting, we can be engaging with other people and not realize that in some of those interactions and engagements, we're essentially looking for some information that's going to confirm some belief, some stereotype, some long-held assumption we have about a particular group or a particular identity. So it's important for us to know that that confirmation bias could be present. And again, try and disengage from that. Try not to seek out either behaviors or actions or information that's going to confirm some stereotype or belief or assumption that you already have about a group of people or a person. So again, I won't go through all of these for the sake of time, but I think it's extremely important to just share that these are some of the unconscious biases that affect the workplace. And so it's important to have techniques or strategies to help interrupt bias. And this is but one. We talked about earlier that system 1 versus system 2 thinking, and that system 1 is very fast and associative, whereas system 2 is much more deliberate, much more slow. So this acronym is one that absolutely fits. Pause. One way that we can interrupt or disengage from bias is to pause before we make decisions. And here it tells you what that refers to: paying attention, acknowledging what you are thinking and feeling, recognizing or understanding actually that there are judgments that you may be making about particular people or groups of people, selecting the most productive way to move forward, and then executing your plan. Again, this is but one technique that can help us interrupt or disengage from bias. Again, every now and then I have to throw in just a couple quotes because I think some of them are just so relevant and timely. Unconscious bias is not something that it's comfortable for us to acknowledge that we have. But I think once we make that acknowledgement, once we face the fact that it's there, then that gives us an opportunity to really put something in place, such as a strategy or a technique that will help us disengage from bias in our decision-making processes. And at this juncture, in the midst of crisis, be it pandemic, be it racial unrest, it is so very important to disengage from that bias, to understand that our employees are humans. They are all experiencing this unprecedented time in a different way. Nobody has the same experience. And so it's so very important for us to try and understand that and just extend them grace. Try and reach out to them, try and understand what their experiences are. You know, what we're hearing in the marketplace is that when this is all said and done, people are going to judge organizations by how they treated their stakeholders during this time. That's what they're going to look back at and make some sort of assessment or gauge how you are. And that's going to really impact the strength of your brand as a company. And the other thing that I think is extremely important to just sort of mention here is that, you know, early on we heard people saying, you know, well, I don't really understand what's going on with my employees. You know, they're just working from home instead of coming in the office. Well, I want to challenge that a little bit. And I'm going to ask you to think about this. Instead of seeing this time frame as a time in which your employees are just working from home, please consider this. Your employees have been sent home in the midst of a pandemic or because of this pandemic. And while they are at home, they are also trying to parent kids who have been sent home. They're trying to become homeschoolers for kids who have been sent home. For those with younger kids, they're also being daycare for kids who have been sent home. Some of them have parents and older relatives who have become a part of this greater extended family through this crisis. They're still trying to be wives or husbands and mothers and fathers and all of these things. So they're not just working from home. They're at home in the midst of all of this uncertainty and still trying to work while there. And I think that's something that's extremely important. And if we can just sort of shift our lens a little bit and consider that, then maybe we can understand that, you know, things are going to be a little bit different. Some deadlines might get missed. Maybe they'll work into the evening as opposed to being fully available during the day. But those are the kinds of things that we want to at least give some consideration to as we think through this particular unprecedented crisis with the pandemic, but also with some of what we have going on with the racial unrest. So what I tried to do, and this is rounding it out, I absolutely promise, I wanted to leave you with what I consider to be a framework for inclusion during crisis. And the thing that I found myself saying since day one of this pandemic and crisis is grace, extending grace. And so I took some time and I actually created a framework around this word grace. And I want to quickly share that with you. I have not committed it to memory, so I'm going to reference a document I have here, but I'm going to share it with you quickly. The G in grace stands for get and give. Get uncomfortable. Have courageous conversations. Have candid conversations with people across difference. Approach those conversations from a learner or growth mindset. Challenge the status quo. All of that is a part of getting uncomfortable. The get is give others space to articulate their perspectives, their concerns, their needs. That's the G. The R, reach and realize. Reach back, reach down, reach up. And why do we reach? Because we want to try and touch others to make a difference in the lives of others. Sometimes we have to reach up. Maybe we're in an organization where our leadership doesn't necessarily understand the importance of diversity and inclusion. Maybe we reach up and share that message. Maybe we reach down or reach back to help someone, to show them some grace or to help open a door or extend an opportunity to someone who might not otherwise get it. So that's the reach. The other R that goes there is realize. Realize that we're all in this together. The A is for ask and amplify. Ask questions. We talked a little bit about the need to ask questions, to actively listen to those responses. But the amplify is being willing to amplify perspectives of underrepresented people or less represented people. Is so very important. If they don't have a voice in the room, try to help create that voice, or maybe you be that voice on their behalf. The C is for change and create. Change policies, processes, procedures, practices, and do so through an inclusive lens. And the C also stands for create. Create inclusive environments where everybody has a sense of belonging, they feel visible, valued, they feel respected. The E is empathy and excellence. When you earnestly seek to understand the perspective and positions of others, that's the empathy that we need. And the E also stands for excellence, where we're asking that you commit to inclusive excellence. In the end, it's about extending grace. And I think that's something that's extremely important during this particular time frame, that we understand that everybody's experiencing this pandemic differently, and we give them the opportunity to share. These are some of the benefits of inclusion, why inclusion matters. For the sake of time, I'm going to move through this piece of it. Individual and group differences, these are all attributes of inclusion. Again, for the sake of time, I'll continue on here, but this is so very important. that we understand what inclusion looks like, and we commit to providing that in our environments. And so the suggestion here is, as we wrap up, that you just identify 3 key takeaways from the things that we've discussed, and consider coming up with action items that are going to help inform your decisions, or things that you commit to, things that you can do in the next 30 to 60 days in order to make a difference going forward. Just do something is what I would suggest. Don't be silent about things that matter. And that's what I have at this point. I do know that ran a little bit long, but I thought it was important to just sort of give some of those insights. Any questions that anyone has, I'd be more than willing to take those at this time.
And let me remind everybody that the questions that you have, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. Deborah, great presentation. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day for this. This is a very important topic.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I appreciate you all listening.
Now, I have one question for you. I have a couple here. So over the years, I've had this radio show for 20 years. I've been an entrepreneur and a business person myself. And I've had many businesses tell me that, whenever the diversity issue comes up, that they say that they would like to be more diverse in their business with their employees, but they never see diversity walking through the door to apply for a job. And so what do you say to these businesses? How can you recommend that they don't just wait on people to walk in the door?
So I think that, again, I think it's important to note that diversity is really context specific. So depending on the organization, diversity can look like different things to different orgs. But one thing that we found to be very helpful is to interact and engage with professional organizations that have diverse memberships. So if you're looking for a particular identity or a particular demographic, more often than not, there are professional organizations or groups that are more like affinity groups, where those individuals are a part of that organization. And so that's one way that we have found that would be most helpful.
All right. And then how should a business address D&I issues that arise due to current events? For example, the recent, police actions, and then, the pandemic and affecting low-income and minority groups more than other groups. So when these things happen in current events, what's a way that businesses, especially small businesses, to address these things? Should they, and I imagine a lot of them just ignore them and allow people to deal with them on their own and talk about it on their own, but should a business be proactive and maybe set up discussion groups?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think being proactive is important. And so it really is about trying to gauge the needs of your stakeholders. So if you have stakeholders that are in those groups, sometimes you can reach out to them and even ask them to help you facilitate some sort of interaction or engagement as a small business owner if you aren't necessarily comfortable doing that on your own. I think it is time for us to begin to have courageous or candid conversations across difference. Because those meaningful interactions and engagements are the only thing I think that's going to allow us to sort of reject this status quo or reject this notion that different is bad and move from this us versus them to this understanding that we truly are all in this together. So I think we're going to have to do something. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are issues. Acknowledge that there is systemic bias, systemic discrimination and racism that has affected where we are today. And then, it doesn't mean that we're trying to blame or shame ourselves or anyone else, but it means that once we understand that these things have impacted our society, then we can try and work to improve things. So I think that's so very important. But I must say that it's important to hear people's stories, to find out what their experiences have been, because that can inform our insights and our decision making as well.
And we have a comment that came in on, I guess, towards my first question there, that there is a report on the South Carolina Human Affairs Commission's website that gives a breakdown of availability of gender within race, skill, or education. And I'm assuming, is that in regards to employment, I guess?
Right, so that's probably talking about the available, I'm drawing a complete blank, but it's basically looking at when you're trying to determine from a diversity perspective who's available to hire. There's actually data through a number of sources that can tell you what people are available in the marketplace and help you from that perspective. I do think, in addition to that, though, that engaging through professional networks is quite beneficial.
And a question about the Darla Moore School, and how will the school institute more support of diversity initiatives with staff and students?
So there are a number of things that we are working on as we speak, one of which is that we're launching a series that we're calling Courageous Conversations. The more I think about it, I may want to sort of work with that name a little bit and maybe call it Candid Conversations, but we're really going to provide a forum for people across difference, to have meaningful conversations. So that's one thing. A number of other initiatives just involve really robust programming. We're also planning to do, at least we're piloting what we call assessments that are called intercultural assessments, where we're going to take certain groups of students and use this assessment to gauge their ability to manage across difference and do sort of a pre-assessment and a post-assessment at the end of their career at the Moore School, or end of their time at the Moore School, and just try and get a sense of whether or not we're doing what we need to do in our curriculum to ensure that our students who come in are moving towards more multicultural mindsets based on what they're learning at the Moore School. But we're doing it through programming, we're doing it through interaction and engagement. You know, we have a council on diversity and inclusion that is comprised of both undergraduate and graduate students that really help inform our insights as an Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And they help us with our programming. We're doing quite a bit of training with our student organizations. We've decided that this year it is a requirement for all of our student orgs at the Moore School to go through what we call inclusive excellence training. It's 5 modules, and it teaches about the basics of diversity and inclusion, about implicit bias, but also makes a business case for more inclusive organizations because we're trying to make a difference at every turn.
All right, and I think we have time for one more question here that just came in. What tips do you have for Black professionals who feel that they are working in organizations that appear apathetic and under leadership that appears unaware of the current racial disparities?
Wow, that's a lot for the final question.
Yeah.
I will say that's an extremely important an extremely important question. So I certainly want to validate the person that put that out there. What I will say to you is this: that you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion has to come from the top down. It has to be driven by executive level leadership. They have to set the standard. And make it very clear that the culture will be one of diversity, equity, and inclusion. When that is absent, it is extremely difficult to have sustainable progress and sustainable change in organizations. You know, sometimes individuals think, well, I'll go in here and I'll try and make a difference as an individual. Making a difference as an individual is important, but do understand that for sustainable change, it has to happen at the organizational level, and it has to be driven by the CEO or someone, well, by the CEO, quite frankly. So, you know, if that is not the case at your current organization, then I would suggest that maybe it's time to make some strategic moves. Maybe it's time to pivot. But there are a number of questions that you can pose in an organization to find out if there is a true commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. In this instance, it doesn't seem like there's a need to ask the question. Apparently, there is no commitment. And I would just say determine whether or not the values in that org align with your values. And if they don't, it may be an opportunity for you to pivot.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much again for your time today and all this great information. I'm really glad that we're recording this so I can go back and use this as a good reference. So thank you very much again. And let me remind everybody that we've got one more segment in this series, Managerial Insights for Businesses During Uncertain Times, and that will air on the South Carolina Business Review radio show tomorrow morning. Joy Von Nessen, one of the top research economists in our state and the chief economist for the Darla Moore School of Business at USC, will be my guest on the show. So that's at 10 till 8 tomorrow morning on the South Carolina Business Review on all 8 South Carolina public radio stations. It's also available as a podcast. You can listen anytime. And then Joey will join us again a week from today for the final Zoom conference in this series. So Mark, back to you.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, Deborah. That was very interesting. I'm a framework guy, and so you had some good frameworks in there. So that was good for me. Your story was really frustrating, but I can understand how that's a learning experience. So that was really interesting. We will, as Mike says, we'll have one more session next week. I will be looking forward to and crossing my fingers that Joey's going to tell us some good news. I'm not sure that we have it or not, but I'm curious to see that. So that'll be next week. As we said earlier, the slides will be available after the presentation today, and the actual recording of the presentation will be available in a couple of days. I encourage you to share it with colleagues, coworkers, or through social media, or however you feel comfortable. And thanks you all for attending, and I hope to see you all next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.